Ryan's office revenge.
I didn't flip any desks. Didn't send a company-wide email telling everyone what I really thought about the place. Didn't storm into my boss's office and quit in some movie-style blowout that would become office legend for years. I just walked away from my home office at 3:24 in the morning, unplugged my headset, removed my security badge from its lanyard, and closed the door behind me. After 24 years of holding their systems together with my bare hands, that's how it ended. Quiet, deliberate, and with the kind of clarity that only comes when you finally stop lying to yourself about what you're actually worth. My name is Richard Cooper. I'm 49 years old, and this is how a $30,000 difference taught me the most expensive lesson of my career. Not about money, but about how companies really value experience versus appearance, loyalty versus politics, and substance versus style. It started on a Wednesday in late September. Humid, overcast, the kind of day that lulls you into thinking nothing significant will happen until everything does. I was working the overnight infrastructure monitoring shift for Pinnacle Financial Systems, a mid-sized company that processes transaction feeds and reconciles payment data across global banking partners. We're not glamorous. We don't have ping-pong tables in the break room or free kombucha on tap. No neon-lit war rooms or venture capital buzzwords scrawled on whiteboards. We just make sure that when someone in New York sends money to someone in California, the numbers land correctly, without fanfare, without credit, and ideally without anyone ever noticing we exist. That was the job. When things worked smoothly, we were invisible. When things broke, that's when every executive, every account manager, every client success representative suddenly remembered we were the thin membrane between order and chaos. I'd been on the night operations team for 24 years now. Started as a junior engineer right out of college when I was 25, back when my oldest daughter Rachel was just learning to say daddy. Now she's a sophomore at State University, and my son Jason's a junior in high school already talking about SAT prep and college applications. Linda, my wife, works part-time as a nurse at the local clinic, and between her schedule and mine, we've managed to keep the family together despite my unconventional hours. The mortgage has 8 years left on it. My lower back aches most mornings from decades of hunching over keyboards at 3 a.m., and I need reading glasses now for anything smaller than 14-point font. But this job pays the bills, covers Rachel's tuition, and at 49, you don't just walk away from steady income and good health insurance, not when you've got a family depending on you. Our operations team consisted of 6 people rotating across 3 shifts like gears in a machine that management never bothered to oil properly. 2 of them were solid, Maria Santos and Tony Rodriguez, both quietly competent, both carrying twice their designated weight without complaint. There was a fresh college graduate, bright, but still learning the crucial difference between a transient network glitch and an actual data integrity threat that could cascade into millions of dollars in failed transactions. Another team member, Kevin Pierce, was permanently heads down on what he called strategic initiatives, which always seemed to coincide with the exact moments when critical systems went sideways at 2 a.m. Then there was Brandon Walsh. Brandon didn't just understand the mechanics of success in corporate America, he had weaponized them into an art form. He showed up to every stand-up meeting in a crisp button-down shirt, even on Zoom calls from his apartment. He'd lean forward attentively when executives spoke, nod in thoughtful agreement, then rephrase their concerns back to them using corporate jargon so seamlessly it sounded like original strategic thinking. We need to prioritize proactive mitigation pathways for our critical infrastructure dependencies, he'd say during team meetings, as if he'd personally debugged the database replication lag that nearly tanked our Asia-Pacific settlement window the previous week. He hadn't. I had. At 4:12 in the morning, while he was sound asleep, I was the one adjusting buffer configurations and coordinating with vendor support through a translator because their engineer only spoke Mandarin. Leadership absolutely adored Brandon. Not because he fixed things when they broke, but because he made them feel like everything was under control, even when it wasn't. He volunteered for every high-visibility project that came down the pipeline, anything involving PowerPoint presentations, project timelines, or demo days for potential clients. Anything that concluded before midnight and could be summarized in executive dashboards with green checkmarks and upward trending arrows. Brandon was 28 years old, fresh out of business school with an MBA in information systems management. He had boundless energy for initiatives that came with slide decks and steering committee meetings. He spoke fluently in the language of quarterly objectives, key performance indicators, and strategic roadmaps. What he didn't have was any real understanding of what happened when those carefully planned systems encountered the messy reality of 3 a.m. emergencies. Meanwhile, I was operating in the shadows, quite literally. My office was my home desk, bathed in the blue glow of multiple terminal windows, while the rest of suburbia slept peacefully. When the payment processor's API suddenly began throttling all requests at 2:47 a.m. due to an undocumented rate limit change that their support team wouldn't acknowledge until business hours, I was the one parsing through thousands of log entries, rerouting traffic through backup endpoints, and writing temporary adapter scripts so our reconciliation jobs wouldn't fail and leave millions in transactions hanging in limbo. I'd been the one who trained Brandon when he joined our team 18 months earlier. Spent weeks walking him through our legacy monitoring systems, explaining the subtle differences between alerts that looked identical but required completely different responses. Showed him the runbooks I'd written and maintained over the years, the tribal knowledge that kept our operation running when the official documentation fell short of reality. He was a quick learner, I'll give him that. Quick enough to absorb the fundamentals and smart enough to sound authoritative when discussing them in meetings I wasn't invited to attend. The performance review system told the real story about our respective roles. Day shift personnel like Brandon were evaluated on deliverables, projects completed, features implemented, initiatives launched. Night shift workers like me were measured primarily on absence of problems. No major outages, no missed SLA targets, no escalations that reached executive attention. If nothing catastrophic happened on our watch, management assumed nothing significant had occurred. So when Brandon talked about maintaining operational stability during team meetings, it sounded impressive to people who had never been awakened at 2:30 a.m. by alert notifications. He had mastered the vocabulary of ownership without bearing the actual responsibility that came with it. I carried the pager, but he carried the narrative. When Patricia Stevens, our operations director, scheduled an all-hands meeting titled Investing in Our Future, I didn't feel hopeful. I'd been through enough corporate restructurings and retention campaigns to recognize the script. At 49, you develop a sixth sense for these things. This wasn't about genuine investment in people. It was about damage control, trying to plug talent leaks before the end of Q4 when budgets get scrutinized and heads start rolling. I knew the basic math of corporate retention. Appreciation costs nothing until panic sets in, and panic costs everything. When companies suddenly start talking about investing in people, it usually means they've already lost someone critical and are scrambling to prevent a mass exodus. The call was textbook corporate theater. Patricia opened with practiced warmth, the kind of measured sincerity that gets refined in leadership retreats and diversity training workshops. She talked about market volatility, competitive talent pressures in the financial technology sector, and how Pinnacle was taking bold, proactive steps to retain the people who truly drive our operational resilience. We've identified key contributors across our critical functions, she said, her smile calibrated to radiate authenticity through the webcam. People whose expertise and unwavering commitment form the backbone of our operational excellence, especially during these challenging market conditions. I sat in my home office, camera turned off, wearing a faded polo shirt, cold coffee growing a film on my desk, and I felt that familiar cold knot forming in my stomach. Not dread exactly, and certainly not excitement, just recognition. I'd seen this exact performance before at my previous company, Meridian Data Solutions, right before they laid off half the operations team and outsourced our functions to a call center in Phoenix. Patricia unveiled the retention bonus program with the enthusiasm of someone announcing lottery winners. Meaningful financial incentives designed to reflect true market value. Competitive packages that recognize both current contributions and future potential. Market-aligned compensation structures that acknowledge the critical nature of what you do. All phrases that sound generous and forward-thinking until you realize they're just corporate euphemisms for, this is what we should have been paying you all along, but we didn't have to until now. The real kicker came at the end. Individual offers would be discussed privately to respect confidentiality and allow for personalized conversations about career development. Translation: we don't want any of you comparing numbers until after you've all signed the agreements and it's too late to coordinate a collective response. Brandon's one-on-one call with Patricia concluded first, naturally. Of course it did. 23 minutes after his meeting ended, he He posted in our team Slack channel with barely contained excitement. "Wow, guys, just had an incredible conversation with leadership, really feeling valued and appreciated right now. They really came through in a big way." Then came the direct message, accompanied by a screenshot, clean, unblurred, no attempt at false modesty or discretion. $45,000. Not stock options that might be worthless in 2 years, not phantom equity tied to impossible performance metrics, not a bonus contingent on hitting nebulous quarterly objectives. Pure liquid cash labeled retention incentive, scheduled for payment in 2 installments over 6 months, contingent only on signing an 18-month commitment agreement. Beneath the screenshot, his message, "Told you they recognize real talent when they see it. This place values people who make things happen." I stared at that number on my screen, $45,000. My fingers actually went numb for a moment. The digits didn't just sit there passively. They seemed to pulse and vibrate at a frequency just below conscious hearing, like a subsonic hum of betrayal. My chest felt simultaneously hollow and weighted, as if someone had surgically removed my ribs and filled the empty space with wet concrete. I already knew what my conversation with Patricia would yield, had known it the moment she used the phrase differential packages based on role complexity and market positioning. That's corporate speak for, we've already decided what everyone is worth, and we're going to dress up those decisions with data and market research so nobody can argue with them effectively. Patricia called me 47 minutes later. Her camera was on, positioned to show a tastefully arranged bookshelf behind her. The lighting was soft and professional. Her smile required visible muscular effort to maintain, the kind of expression that demands conscious attention to keep from collapsing into its natural state. "Richard," she began, her voice carrying the warmth of coffee that's been reheated 3 times. "First and foremost, I want to thank you for everything you do. You've been absolutely critical to our operational stability, especially during those challenging overnight hours when most of our leadership team isn't available. Your dedication hasn't gone unnoticed." I nodded without speaking, didn't offer any pleasantries or acknowledgments, just waited for her to get to the point. After 24 years in corporate environments, I'd learned that the length of the preamble is usually inversely proportional to the quality of what follows. "We're really excited to offer you a retention bonus as part of this program," she continued, her enthusiasm sounding increasingly forced with each word. "This package reflects how much we value your contributions and how important you are to our ongoing operational success, particularly given your deep institutional knowledge and crisis management capabilities." Another tactical pause. Not for dramatic effect, this was strategy. She was giving me a beat to feel grateful and valued before telling me exactly how little that gratitude was worth in dollars and cents. "We're prepared to offer you $15,000, paid over 2 installments, contingent on signing an 18-month commitment agreement that includes some standard non-compete and confidentiality provisions." For several seconds, my brain simply refused to process what she'd said. Not because the math was complicated, but because the number was so insulting it seemed like a clerical error. $15,000, not $50,000, not even $25,000, $15,000, as in barely enough to cover 1 semester of Rachel's tuition, as in exactly 1/3 of what they'd just offered Brandon for doing the same fundamental job with half the experience and none of the after-hours responsibility. I must have looked stunned, or maybe even hurt, because Patricia's carefully maintained smile flickered slightly around the edges. Her eyes showed the first genuine crack in her performance as she rushed to fill the silence. "I know you might have questions about the structure," she said, speaking faster now. "These decisions involve numerous factors: market research, role categorization, departmental budget allocations, career trajectory analysis. But I want to be absolutely clear that this offer reflects how much we value what you do and your importance to this organization." "Brandon got $45,000, I said. My voice came out flat and emotionless, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Someone watching this conversation from a distance, perhaps from the ceiling, observing this corporate theater with detached curiosity. Her face froze for exactly half a second, but that was long enough for me to watch the gears turning behind her eyes. Should she deny it outright? Deflect with more corporate speak? Double down on the justification? I could practically see her cycling through the options her leadership training had prepared her for. "I can't discuss other team members' compensation details," she replied carefully, falling back on the human resources shield like a soldier diving into a foxhole. But I can tell you that day operations and night operations have different market benchmarks and responsibility profiles. We do the same job, I said simply. You have different visibility profiles and stakeholder interaction patterns, she countered, as if those words meant something concrete rather than serving as a euphemistic way to say that one of us was seen and the other wasn't. There it was, the naked truth, wrapped in PowerPoint bullet points and delivered with practiced sincerity. Brandon was visible to leadership. I was not. Therefore, Brandon mattered in ways that I didn't. The quality of our work, the impact of our contributions, the years of experience and institutional knowledge, none of that factored into the equation as much as simple visibility. Something fundamental shifted inside me at that moment. Not with a dramatic snap or explosive realization, but with the slow, irreversible movement of a deadbolt sliding into place. A door I hadn't even realized was still ajar finally clicked shut, and I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back to whatever relationship I'd had with this company before this conversation. I need to think about it, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Of course, Patricia replied, relief flooding her voice like she'd just avoided stepping on a landmine. Take all the time you need, just let me know by end of week so we can process everything through HR and get the paperwork finalized. The call ended with the soft click that signals the death of pretense. I sat in my home office, lights off except for the familiar glow from my monitoring displays, and opened a spreadsheet. Not to torture myself, just to see the situation with mathematical clarity. Brandon, $45,000. Richard, $15,000. Difference, $30,000. Those numbers sat there on my screen like an indictment, stark and unforgiving. Then I started pulling other data, the kind of information that tells the real story behind corporate decision-making. Incidents resolved in the last 12 months. I had closed 253 critical tickets. Brandon had closed 91, and most of those were handled during business hours with full technical team support available. Emergency escalations during weekend outages. I'd been the primary responder for every major incident in the past 18 months. Brandon had been marked as unavailable or non-responsive for emergency coverage in 74% of after-hours situations. The data didn't lie, even when everything else did. My shift that night started at 11 p.m., as usual. I should have spent the afternoon sleeping, preparing for another long night of monitoring systems and responding to alerts. Instead, I found myself reading through the retention agreement Patricia had emailed. 18 months. Immediate repayment of the full bonus amount if I left the company early, prorated by month with penalties for early departure. A comprehensive confidentiality clause prohibiting me from discussing program details with anyone, including other employees. A section explicitly stating that my at-will employment status remained completely unchanged despite the retention agreement. They wanted me locked in place. They also wanted complete freedom to change their minds about me at any point. The contract was designed to trap employees while giving the company maximum flexibility. Classic corporate risk management: socialize the benefits, privatize the costs. That evening, Linda and I had dinner with the kids for the first time in weeks. My schedule usually meant I was either sleeping during dinner hours or already logged in for the night shift. Jason talked about his upcoming SAT prep course and which colleges he was considering for early admission. Rachel called from her dorm to ask about a spring break trip her friends were planning. Normal family conversations that reminded me why I'd been grinding through overnight shifts for so many years. "You seem distracted, honey," Linda said as we cleaned up after dinner. "Everything okay at work?" I almost told her about the bonus situation right then. Almost explained how 24 years of loyalty and expertise had been valued at exactly 1/3 of what they'd offered someone who'd been there for less than 2 years. But looking at her tired face after a long day at the clinic, thinking about Rachel's tuition payments and Jason's college applications, I just said, "Yeah, just some changes coming. I'll figure it out." At 11:05 p.m., I logged into the monitoring dashboard for what would turn out to be the last time. Everything looked stable. Normal transaction volume, all systems showing green, queue depths within acceptable parameters. I pulled up the incident response runbook, the comprehensive document I'd built and maintained over the years because nobody else took responsibility for keeping it current. At 11:53 p.m., Brandon sent me a message that would stick in my memory forever. "Hey man, big day tomorrow. Critical client demo during Asia Pacific trading hours. Make sure nothing weird happens, okay? Really need this to go smoothly. Make sure nothing weird happens. As if I had some kind of mystical control over when third-party payment processors decided to change their API specifications without warning. As if system stability was something I could simply will into existence, like ordering a sandwich. We'll monitor closely, I replied, falling back on the professional response that had become automatic over the years. Awesome, that's what I told the VP, that you'd handle whatever came up. We make a solid team. We make a solid team. The royal we that somehow included Brandon in credit for work he'd never actually done. The we that would appear in his performance reviews and promotion discussions while I remained invisible in the background, keeping the systems running so his visibility could flourish. At 1:34 a.m., an alert fired that would change everything. Transaction reconciliation lag was climbing steadily. Not catastrophic yet, but trending in a direction that could cascade into serious problems if left unchecked. I pulled up the logs and began tracing the issue with the methodical approach that comes from years of experience. A vendor's API had been updated to a new version that was sending timestamp data in a completely different format than their documentation specified. Our parsing system was choking on the unexpected format, generating retry attempts that were creating back pressure across the entire transaction ingestion pipeline. It was the kind of problem that could spiral into a complete system failure if not addressed quickly and properly. I faced 3 options, and the choice I made would define everything that followed. Option 1, implement a quick manual override that would temporarily solve the parsing issue, but wouldn't scale if transaction volume increased overnight. Option 2, disable the vendor's new API version entirely and fall back to their legacy system, which would stabilize operations but might create data gaps in our reporting. Option 3, fix the parsing logic properly, which would take about 45 minutes of concentrated work but would actually solve the underlying problem permanently. For 24 years, I had always chosen option 3, always taken the extra time to implement the right solution instead of the quick fix, always prioritized long-term stability over short-term convenience. That was what separated professionals from technicians, engineers from button pushers. That was my value to the organization, even if they couldn't see it. As I sat there at 1:41 a.m. staring at the error logs scrolling across my screen, something fundamental shifted in my thinking. Why was I choosing option 3? Who benefited from my extra effort? Would Brandon get credit for the proactive system optimization that prevented a major outage? Would Patricia include this incident in her quarterly report as evidence of strong operational leadership? At 2:16 a.m., while I was still analyzing the problem and considering my options, my phone rang. Patricia's name appeared on the screen, and I realized she was probably getting automated alerts about system performance degradation. "Richard," she said, her voice tight with the kind of anxiety that comes from being awakened by critical system alerts. "I'm seeing some concerning metrics in the dashboard. What's our status?" I explained the situation with technical precision. Root cause identified, multiple resolution approaches available, estimated timeline for each option. Professional, thorough, exactly the kind of response that had defined my reputation for 2.5 decades. "How serious is this? Is it contained? Should I start making phone calls?" "It should be resolved well before Asian market open," I assured her. "This won't impact any client operations." "Good. Brandon mentioned there's an important demonstration scheduled for tomorrow morning with potential new clients. We really can't afford any technical issues." Of course Brandon had mentioned that. And of course Patricia was calling me at 2:16 a.m. to make sure Brandon's demo would go smoothly while he slept peacefully in his apartment, confident that I would handle whatever problems arose. "I understand the situation," I said simply. "I'll keep you updated if anything changes." She hung up, probably satisfied that her $15,000 investment was hard at work protecting the company's reputation, while her $45,000 investment rested comfortably, preparing for tomorrow's visibility opportunity. I deployed a temporary fix at 2:41 a.m., not the comprehensive solution I would normally implement, just enough to stabilize the immediate problem. Then I spent 15 minutes documenting the issue and updating the incident log with minimal detail. At 3:08 a.m., Brandon sent another message. "Heard there was some excitement tonight. Everything handled?" "Resolved," I replied. "Perfect. Knew you'd take care of it. Tomorrow's demo should go great now." I stared at those words for a long time. Tomorrow's demo should go great now, not "Thanks for staying up all night fixing problems." Not, "I appreciate you handling the crisis while I slept." Just satisfaction that his important presentation would proceed smoothly because I had done what was expected of me. At 3:24 a.m., something inside me made a decision that my conscious mind took several seconds to recognize. I stood up from my desk, unplugged my headset from the monitoring system, removed my security access badge from its lanyard, and set my work phone face down on the desk where it could continue glowing with unacknowledged Slack notifications and unread system alerts. Then I walked out of my home office and closed the door behind me. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical gestures or emotional outbursts, just quietly, deliberately, with the kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop pretending that endurance equals value and exhaustion equals importance. For the first time in 24 years, I was done. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was panicking about what I'd done, but because my mind had gone quiet in a way it hadn't experienced in decades. No mental background processes running through potential system failures. No anxiety about whether I'd documented something clearly enough for the next shift. No voice in the back of my head asking whether I should check the monitoring dashboard one more time before trying to rest. Just silence, clean and complete. By 9 a.m., my work phone was vibrating continuously. Slack messages stacked up like planes circling an airport during a storm. Text messages from team members. Multiple missed calls from Patricia that she didn't bother following up with voicemails, which told me everything I needed to know about her confidence level in handling the situation independently. I logged into my work email exactly once, just to assess the scope of what was unfolding. The overnight ticket queue had grown to 23 unresolved issues. Several critical alerts had triggered that someone, probably Tony or Maria, had attempted to handle but had inadvertently made worse through incomplete understanding of the underlying systems. A client in Singapore had escalated directly to their account executive about transaction processing delays. Another client was threatening to invoke SLA penalty clauses over data reconciliation failures that should have been prevented. Buried in my inbox was a calendar invitation that made me laugh out loud. Urgent operational coverage discussion, all hands required. No apology, no acknowledgement of the situation's causes, just corporate urgency attempting to mobilize resources to solve a problem they'd created through willful blindness. That's when the emotional numbness I'd been experiencing since 3:24 a.m. transformed into something sharper and more focused. This wasn't an isolated bad night or a communication misunderstanding. This was the inevitable culmination of 24 years of a systematic pattern I'd been too tired, too professional, or too hopeful to fully confront until now. I spent the morning methodically going through my personal files, downloading performance reviews from the past 5 years, exporting my complete ticket resolution history, and cross-referencing major incident reports with on-call schedules. Every critical system saved during the past 2 years had occurred between midnight and 6 a.m. My name appeared in the resolution documentation for 91% of them. Brandon's name appeared in 8%, usually in phrases like coordinated stakeholder communications or facilitated post-incident review sessions. At 6:15 p.m., Patricia called again. This time I answered, curious to see how she would frame the situation. She abandoned any pretense of pleasantries and went straight to business. "Richard, last night's issues created some significant challenges. We really need consistency and reliability in our overnight coverage, especially with several high-stakes client presentations happening this week." "Then you should pay for consistency and reliability," I replied simply. Silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. "Richard, I understand you might be feeling undervalued right now, but—" "I want off permanent night shift rotation," I interrupted, my voice calm but completely firm. "I want documentation and training standards that prevent single points of failure. I want compensation that reflects the actual scope and impact of the work. Otherwise, this retention agreement doesn't make sense for me or my family." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her breathing, could practically feel her mental calculations about budget constraints, departmental politics, and quarterly performance targets. Those kinds of structural changes aren't something we can address immediately. Right now, we need you focused on operational execution. There it was, stripped of all corporate euphemisms. They needed me, but they weren't willing to respect me. They wanted my dependence without offering dignity in return. "I understand your position completely," I said, and I truly did understand it for the first time in years. That night, I didn't log into any work systems. I didn't check alert dashboards or respond to emergency messages. Linda and I went to see a movie instead, some mindless action film that let me turn off my brain for 2 hours without thinking about queue depths, API timeouts, or whether anyone was drowning in problems I used to solve automatically. By the time we returned home, my work phone showed 21 missed calls. At 11:43 p.m., Brandon sent a message that perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with our professional relationship. "Dude, where are you? Everything is falling apart here. Client demo got postponed. VP is asking questions. Really need you to jump on this." I read his message twice, thinking about every time he'd logged off early while I stayed late to fix critical issues. Every time he'd summarized my technical work in meetings using buzzwords that made it sound like strategic planning rather than emergency firefighting. Every time he'd used "we" when he meant "you." At 12:28 a.m., Patricia called again. I let it go directly to voicemail, and this time she actually left one, which signaled that her confidence had completely collapsed. "Richard, it's Patricia. We really need to talk as soon as possible. Please call me back regardless of the time. This situation is becoming critical." The next morning, everything accelerated with the grinding inevitability of a system that had been running on patches and prayers for too long. At 9:17 a.m., Pinnacle's external status page shifted from green to yellow for the first time in 18 months. Someone in leadership had made the decision to publicly acknowledge problems, which meant the issues were severe enough that hiding them would create more damage than transparency. At 10:33 a.m., Charles Morrison, the VP of Engineering, called me personally. I'd interacted with Charlie exactly 4 times in 24 years, always during major post-incident reviews, when executives needed to understand what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. "Richard," he said, dispensing with any small talk or relationship building, "we're experiencing cascading system failures across multiple operational areas. Patricia tells me you have critical historical knowledge about these systems." Historical knowledge, not expertise, not ownership, not technical leadership, just historical knowledge, as if I were a reference book instead of the engineer who'd been preventing these exact failures for over 2 decades. "I do have that knowledge," I confirmed. "Can you join an emergency bridge call with our technical leadership team? We need all hands on this." I thought about the retention agreement sitting in my email, about Brandon's $45,000 compared to my $15,000, about 24 years of 3 a.m. phone calls and weekend emergency responses. "I could help," I said slowly, "but I won't." The silence was profound. "I don't understand. Why wouldn't you help during a crisis?" "Because your company just told me I'm worth $15,000 to retain for 18 months while Brandon is worth $45,000. Those numbers represent your assessment of our relative value. I'm respecting that assessment." "This isn't about compensation structures." "It's exactly about compensation structures," I interrupted. "You've made your decision about what my expertise is worth. I'm simply accepting that decision and acting accordingly." By Thursday afternoon, the technical crisis had been contained, not because root causes had been addressed, but because Pinnacle had thrown enough contractors and emergency consultants at the problem to implement temporary workarounds. The real reckoning, however, was just beginning. Patricia disappeared first. Not fired exactly, just quietly transferred to some ambiguous role in vendor relations where she couldn't make decisions about technical personnel. Her Slack status went permanently offline. Brandon lasted longer, continuing to post frequent updates and volunteer for high-visibility recovery initiatives. But now people were listening for substance rather than style. When asked about replication lag thresholds, he offered vague references to data integrity best practices. When questioned about API failure modes, he didn't know which vendors were involved or what the backup procedures entailed. 3 weeks later, a former colleague who'd started his own consulting practice called me about a contract opportunity. Financial systems architecture for mid-sized companies, day shift work, clear project boundaries, and no 24/7 on-call expectations. The daily rate was so far above my old salary that my $15,000 retention bonus looked like a calculation error. Linda was nervous initially. 24 years of steady employment and health insurance isn't something you walk away from lightly, especially with college expenses and a mortgage. But when she saw me sleeping through the night for the first time in years, when I was actually present for Jason's basketball games instead of monitoring alerts on my phone, when my chronic back pain started improving without the constant stress of crisis management, She understood. 6 months later, I heard through industry contacts that Pinnacle's retention bonus program had been suspended pending a comprehensive review of compensation equity. Corporate speak for "we got caught." Brandon served out his full 18-month commitment because the contract penalties made leaving impossible, but there were no promotions, no additional bonuses, and no special projects. Just 547 days of watching the clock and waiting for his professional sentence to end. As for me, the first time my phone rang at 2 a.m. in my new life, it was a wrong number. Someone who thought I was their friend calling about a personal emergency. I silenced it and went back to sleep without any adrenaline surge, without running through mental checklists, without dread, because those systems and their problems weren't mine to carry anymore. The real turning point wasn't walking out at 3:24 a.m. It came weeks later when I realized I'd stopped waking up at dawn automatically reaching for my phone, no longer bracing for disaster notifications that might require immediate response. That's when I understood the difference between endurance and value, between exhaustion and importance. For 24 years, I'd mistaken being indispensable for being valued. Pinnacle paid to retain the wrong person not because they didn't have the data to make better decisions, but because visibility mattered more to them than reliability. I finally stopped pretending that kind of logic would ever make sense to me. In that acceptance, not of defeat, but of truth, I discovered something I'd forgotten existed: professional dignity, personal peace, and the freedom that comes from knowing your actual worth instead of accepting someone else's undervaluation of it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop doing what you've always done. The system didn't break when I left. It revealed it was already broken, held together by one person's willingness to accept less than they deserved.